So I know there's quite a few of you with the awesome 1.8T, the 20 valve engine, quite an early engine from the Volkswagen group, but it is phenomenal when it comes to tuning and upgrading it. And there's a lot of confusion about those early models as to what they contained and things to look out for. So you might wrongly assume that all 1.8T blocks are exactly the same, and it's pretty much just down to software and a few revisions to the hardware that was fitted to them. But actually the differences are very, very complex. So in this video, we're just going to look at the various differences you get on the 1.8T 20 valve blocks. We're going to be looking at the wrist pin sizes. We're going to be looking at the turbochargers. We're going to be looking at port sizes and also the many other little subtle differences between the different generations. There were two primary revisions of the 1.8T 20 valve engine. The first is referred to as the 058 block, and second one is referred to as the 06A block. So is there much difference between these two blocks? The 1.8T originally started to be mounted longitudinally in cars, long ways, and later we see it starting to be fitted transversely. The 058 block was manufactured from about 1996 to 2000. And one of the main things that sets these apart is the intermediate shaft that drives that oil pump. These blocks also have an external water pump driven by an accessory belt, and in pretty much all cases I've seen, these tend to come with a cast iron block. So the 06A was later born. So as technology has progressed, that was certainly something that was applied to the 1.8T engine. This second generation 06A engine block debuted in the mid-2000s, and it was versatile enough to be mounted longitudinally and transversely, making it ideal for so many cars in the Volkswagen Group lineup. The 06A platforms also offered cast or forged internal components, so that's something to watch out for when you're buying one. So one of the notable updates on this engine is the timing belt driven water pump. The oil pump was now train driven, directly connecting to a gear on the crankshaft nose. So the 06A block revision was found on all the high performance variants. That would include Seat's Leon Cupra, the Audi S3, the Audi TT. So these all share the 20mm wrist pin. We're going to touch on wrist pins later. There were two options, the 19mm and the 20mm. So we're going to discuss wrist pins in a little more detail later on. You can make an assumption really that all the 225 horsepower engines had the 20mm wrist pins, and most of the other lower powered ones had the 19mm. But it does start to get a little foggy as you start coming away from the 225 horsepower. And one thing I've learnt with these engines is never to make assumptions. You can buy, for example, an AGU block, assuming everything inside is nicely forged and you've got the big head on it, only to strip it down and find that the components you expected to find on it are not necessarily on it. So sometimes that's down to people changing parts out as the engine starts getting older. And other times I think Volkswagen have just kicked around the parts bin and put whatever's available to get engines out as quickly as possible. So it's accurate in most cases, but you can't assume from the engine code that you've got a very specific type of engine. So when you talk to people about power limits on the 1.8T block, I tend to go with the most conservative values that are offered. So a lot of people will say about 350 to 400 horsepower. But in reality, if you've got one of the forged bottom ends and you've got one of the more substantial engines, there's no reason really why you can't push that to the 500-600 horsepower mark. So this is a really versatile engine. Please let me know what your thoughts are on power limits. It always seems to open up a great debate. So I'm not going to be dogmatic and say this is a power limit, because as with anything, you can always push it a little bit more. You may have a particularly good block, and because of the different types of blocks that were offered, some are better at tuning and others will start to top out at much lower power limits. So I'm going to drop a link to our website which covers an article which really outlines what I've found so far with regard to engine codes, whether they've got the small port, the big port, the forged parts and other aspects of the engine, just to help people to identify it. I'm only putting things there that I have actually verified, so there may be some missing information. If there is, please let me know in the comments on this video or on the article as well, just so I can update it and really give you the most up-to-date information available for this great little engine. So when you start stripping down these engines, just bear in mind that the factory fitted bolts are often stretched. Refitting them is just going to cause problems, so never refit the bolts. So we're talking here specifically about the head bolts, the crank damper pulley to timing wheel bolt, and the flywheel bolts. So the ARP 2000s are really good bolts. Most tuners I've spoken to have mentioned the ARP 2000s as particularly good options on this engine. Some won't consider any others. Let me know in the comments if you found a decent range of bolts that work well on this engine and can cope with those higher power figures that a lot of our viewers are actually aiming for. So delving a little more into the technical information on these engines, the compression ratio is about 9.5 to 1 on most of the engines. The higher performance variants tend to drop the compression ratio slightly to 9.1 to 1. That allows them to use slightly bigger turbos to increase the amount of air going into the engine. The early models tended to have the KO3, that was then replaced by the KO3S turbo, and then you have the KO4 turbo. And one thing I've learned is that all the KO3Ss or all the KO4s are not identical. They have slightly different constructions, they have slightly different spool up characteristics, and some are better attuned to give those higher power figures. So generally with anything, when you go to tune an engine, the later, more recent parts are usually better than those early ones. There's always a few exceptions. Let me know if you found any out. But if you're looking to strip the engine down and rebuild it, always try and source the latest spec components, because they've often ironed out problems, weak spots or issues that may have become evident after manufacturing and these things have been put out into the wild and actually used in anger. The KO3s and KO3Ss, generally speaking, were put in engines that produce between 150 and 180 horsepower. The engines that were putting out 210 to 240 horsepower tended to have the KO4 version of the turbocharger. Again, I can't be absolutely dogmatic. As with anything, there are exceptions to just about every rule when it comes to these engines. So having a forged crank in the bottom of the engine makes a substantial difference to the longevity of the engine and how much power you can actually put through it. So there's lists of engines that have the forged parts. As I said earlier, you can't always guarantee that your engine code has those forged parts. So if you're stripping it down, it's worth just double checking that those parts are indeed forged that you're expecting. So it would actually be wrong to assume that you can just drop the forged crank from one version of the 1.8T into another version. For example, if you've got an AEB engine code block and you want to fit the forged crank from ABA version of the engine, there's a little bit of internal machining that you need to do in order to get the clearance right on that. So you need to grind it down a small portion of the inside of the block on the intake side of the engine, just to make sure that you clear the cylinder 2 rod. And you also need to machine away just over half of the intermediate shaft gear in order to clear cylinder 4 rod. So it really does pay to just be aware of the nuances and differences between these engines, and not just to assume that the crank and the pistons from one engine will fit cleanly into the block of another, because that's just not the case. You can get caught out. You can start running up serious amounts of money trying to get round these problems where a little bit of research would have saved you from going down that dark alleyway. And bear in mind as well that some of the higher performance pistons of stronger metals have different stretch characteristics. So they may tend to rattle a little bit more when the engine is cold. They may not be very well suited to everyday driving. So you might think you're buying the very best of the best, but actually you can create some unexpected problems just by doing that if you're using the car on a daily basis. So do your research carefully and get parts that are appropriate to your planned use of your car. So when it comes to the 1.8T 20 valve engines, people often think about the port sizes. There was a small port version and a large port version. You might automatically assume that you want the large port version because larger always sounds like you'll make more power. So if you check out the link below, you'll see a list of engines that have been identified as having the large port and other engines that have been identified as having the small port. So is there much difference between these? Well, don't worry too much about the port size. It depends very much on your hopes and aspirations for your own particular engine. In my experience, most of the small port heads can support around 450 horsepower. I've even seen people getting around 600 horsepower through those small port heads. So it's not necessarily going to hold you back. So the differences really come into where the power is delivered. The small port heads offer greater velocity and airflow into the engine at lower RPM ranges, and the large port really starts to shine at those higher RPM ranges. So it depends on where you want the power. Do you need the power at the top end, or do you want that low end torque for everyday driving? So don't worry too much if you've got a small port engine. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be down on power or not achieving the full potential of your project. But for the larger power gains, most people will be dropping in the large port head or even doing a large valve conversion on it. So some of these engines came with a variable valve timing. So the camshaft controls the opening and the closing of the valves at the top of the engine and has a big bearing on how power is delivered. So with variable valve timing, the engine can make adjustments to the cam profile and just really optimize it for the engine load and the RPM range that you're operating in. So that can make significant improvements to the engine. So if you don't have the variable valve timing, then I would certainly recommend you think about dropping a performance cam in, because that'll allow you to extend the durations and profiles. You won't obviously get as much control over it as you would if you had an engine with the variable valve timing, but that goes a long way to addressing the shortfall or the differences between those two engine types. So if you're choosing rods for your 1.8T engine, you will have a choice of I-beam and H-beams, but it's not even such a simple choice as just those two options. There's certainly a lot of variety out there. H-beam rods, generally speaking, are more robust. They can withstand the extremes of a performance engine. So they're probably the option that most people would think about fitting in a 1.8T project. But you've also got the option of a tapered H-beam, which saves weight at the reciprocating end of the rod. And that also provides increased clearance for boxed pistons. So they strike a good balance between strength and durability. And you also get weight reduction benefits from that as well, which enhances the engine's ability to rev and deliver the power that you want. The straight H-beams are really engineered specifically for strength, so they're slightly heavier. But in high performance applications, most people will take strength over weight saving. But again, it depends on your aims and your aspirations for your project. So please let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on rod choices for the 1.8T engine. What did you go for? Why did you choose it? And how are you getting on with that? We can't really talk about changing the rods and going into the engine without talking about the wrist pins, the essential connection within the engine connecting the rods to the pistons. The wrist pins take the brunt of the forces generated in the compressive loads that are going on inside the engine during the combustion process. And as far as the OEM ones go, most people will look to replace those with better performance alternatives. So you would look at what material the wrist pin is made of and also the diameter. So the 19mm or 20mm wrist pins, obviously they're not interchangeable. You don't want gap. You don't want to be trying to stretch a small one onto a big one or vice versa. It's just going to cause all sorts of problems. So do take that measurement. I've seen a lot of people get caught out, and I've had feedback from people on the previous video we did on the 1.8T engine who've had issues with the wrist pins and have basically ordered the wrong parts. So generally, when I've spoken to tuners and when we start looking at modifying and upgrading this engine, the 20mm pins are larger. They are better able to withstand those higher pressures and they tolerate higher amounts of tuning. So generally the 20mm pins are the ones that you should go for, unless you've got a specific need to stick with the 19mm, i.e. you couldn't be bothered to upgrade the other components and you just want something that will mate to it. So you've got mild steel and tool grade steel. There's various different grades around. The tooled ones, the better steel, are generally about $100, 120, 130 pounds more than the softer ones, but they are really worth that investment. It's not a corner that you really want to cut when you start tuning your 1.8T engine. So bear that in mind when you're going out. You will get what you pay for, and generally if you buy cheap you end up buying twice at some point down the line in the near future. So most of the large port 1.8Ts have the larger wrist pin, the 20mm size, and most of the small ports have the 19mm. So that's a good rule of thumb, but as with anything I've said in this video, you've got to take it with a pinch of salt. There's exceptions to the rule, so do your research. Just be aware of those differences so you don't get caught out when you start buying parts. So another difference on the 1.8T engines you should be aware of is the ECUs. They all work quite differently. The newer ones are generally more flexible, more advanced, and are more suited to those higher power figures. You've got the narrow band and the wide band. You've got some cars that came with the drive-by-wire throttle control, control. Others still use the conventional cable system. So what you have really determines your upgrade path. There's nothing stopping you from getting an aftermarket ECU and just replacing everything, but it's usually a lot of work, but that will give you a lot more control over your end project. So certainly be aware of the ECU, the differences between the ECUs and what they actually offer. And that'll also affect the other components that you fit. For example, if you fitted a larger airflow sensor, you need the ECU to be specifically calibrated to that airflow sensor. Otherwise, it's going to get confusing readings and it's just going to throw error codes and you're going to be in limp home mode. So we've seen some really impressive projects on the 1.8T engine. We've seen power figures of 500 to 700 horsepower. So for most people, you need to think about the power limits in your everyday drive. Have you got the traction? If you have a quattro system or a four-wheel drive system, you're going to be able to put down significant amounts of power. If you've got front-wheel drive, you are going to start to have traction issues around about 225 to 250 horsepower. So bear that in mind. A clever differential, a torque sensing differential, will certainly help you go some way to putting that power down. Fitting wider tyres, stickier tyres as well on the front will also help you to put the power down. But don't start thinking you're going to go for a 350 horsepower project if you've only got front wheel drive, because the traction problems are going to make that almost unusable on the roads. It'll certainly be a fun car to take out on the track, but it's going to have all sorts of limitations and restrictions. So think about your project as a whole, not just the power that you want to add specifically to your engine. And also the cost goes up exponentially. So pushing to 200 horsepower is relatively cheap and simple. Going up to 300, 350, there's an inordinate amount more cost involved. And then the next 100 or 200 horsepower, you're putting up the cost significantly even more. So the laws of diminishing returns very much apply when it comes to applying mods to your 1.8T engine. I've done a video that goes into the KO3 K03s and the KO4 turbochargers. I'm going to be doing an update to that video very soon, so please stay tuned to the channel and just make sure you don't miss out on that. But check out the other videos on the 1.8T. But now we're just going to have a little chat about tuning and upgrading the 1.8T engine and the best mods, or what you should really be looking at to get the most out of your 1.8T project. On turbo choices on the 1.8T, there's quite a big array to choose from. The KO4064, as fitted on the next gen Audi S3, is certainly one of those top spec cars that a lot of people are aiming for. But if you want power of about 400 horsepower, that will certainly get you there. But bear in mind that this doesn't really start spooling up and delivering the power till about 2,500 RPM. So the bottom end is going to feel quite lifeless. So if you can live with that and you just want that headline big power figure, then certainly by all means go for that option. But for most people, I would strongly recommend you just stick with a KO3S or a hybrid that uses the KO3S shell, and it's just been machined out to take a different profile of turbines to give you the spool characteristics that you actually want for your project. So for the more adventurous, you'll be looking at fitting a stroker kit. The 1.8 TFSI bottom end has often been used in the 1.8T engine. That can be used to increase the stroke, change the compression ratio, and just really helps you with more capacity in the engine, obviously, to make more power from the mods that you do. If you're aiming at going beyond 550, 600 horsepower, then it's a good idea to get a girdle kit to just strengthen and reinforce the engine. There's a lot of stresses, a lot of flexing goes on, and the girdle kit just keeps everything firmly in place. It can prevent all sorts of problems from happening further down the line after you've been tuning the car and using it in anger on the road. So most people would say the head is really the restriction. You've got the 20 valves, so it's certainly better than most of the heads out there. But if you want to look at serious power improvements, then focus on the head. Getting the head ported and flowed can make substantial differences to the velocity of the air going into the engine and remove any potential restrictions or bottlenecks there. It also aids the atomization of the fuel if done properly, so you're extracting that little bit more power from every drop of fuel that's going into your engine. So don't skimp out on the water pump or the oil pump. The cheaper alternatives have been causing all sorts of issues, from leaks to early premature failures. The OEM water pumps are plastic, which is not a great idea in a performance engine. So a manufacturer called HEPU, let me know in the comments how to pronounce that, because I've not found any definitive answer. But they make a really nice strong metal component water pump which lasts much longer than those standard OEM aluminium plastic ones. In terms of the oil pump, we'd recommend the Pierberg oil pump. That seems to be a really good option on the 1.8T engine. Again, let me know in the comments what your experience has been with oil pumps. I really want as many different opinions as possible. I want to do a definitive tuning guide to the 1.8T engine, so I really need your feedback and your experience to make that happen. And I'm really grateful for all the people that have so far left comments on the videos that I've done. That's really helped to broaden my knowledge and share the knowledge with the community as a whole. So turbocharger upgrades and mapping are really the best routes to go for fairly easy power gains on the 1.8T. Check out our 1.8T tuning video, because that really goes into all of these mods and just explains what you can expect when you start changing the turbo, or increasing the flow rate in the ECU, or changing the tune within the ECU. When it comes to upgrading the injectors on the 1.8T, the thing you've got to bear in mind is it's a 20 valve design. Most cars have a 16 valve design. So swapping out the injectors from other manufacturers of car is often counterproductive. The spray pattern is optimized to assume the fuel is going through 2 valves, when in reality on the 20 valve head it's going through 3 valves. So just a bad choice of injector can affect the spray pattern. And if you're wondering why you're down on power, not achieving the full potential of what you thought you were putting into the engine, it could just be down to something silly like the wrong spray pattern on those injectors. The 1.8T engine, the 20 valve version, is one of the most phenomenal engines out there. I can see why it's got such a big following, such a passionate following of people dedicated to tuning it and extracting more power. People ask me if it's a reliable engine. You've got to remember that these engines are getting on for 20 plus years old now, so any engine of that age is going to potentially be unreliable. But as many people are going to be stripping it down and rebuilding it, you're back up to that original legendary factory reliability. So a lot of people would say the 1.8T 20 valve was one of the last good engines from the Volkswagen Group, and it certainly does tick those boxes. I've got other videos coming out on the more recent engines from the Volkswagen Group, the Gen 3 or the Evo revisions that they've done on the TFSI engines. So you might be interested in just sticking around to watch that video when it comes out, just so you can compare what Volkswagen Group are up to now with what they did on these early engines. So I hope this video has answered a lot of your questions, cleared up a lot of confusion about the differences between the various 1.8T engines. Please boot that like button, because that really does help us to get out there. Let us know in the comments what car you've got, what project you're working on, what mods and upgrades you're planning for it. That'll help me to shape future content so I can produce videos that are actually of specific interest to you. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so you don't miss out on the great content that we've got planned for your engine in the very, very near future. So stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, and check out this video that you should find really interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.